So the format of my presentation is going to be slightly different from what you've been hearing. You're still going to see pictures and hear me talk, but it's a bit different. I'm not an academic, so you have to forgive me. This is Lynn. She's a young woman from Vietnam, and I wanted to share her story with you because, for me, it really highlights why it's fundamental to work to reduce inequality within and among nations, which is what SDG 10 is all about. Before telling you about her, a bit about her country. She's from Vietnam, which is the easternmost country in the Indochina Peninsula, and it has a population of over 90 million people. Overall, in Vietnam, the inequality has not grown, or at least according to all documents, it's grown relatively little in the last 20 years. However, the country still faces major inequality concerns, particularly for rural Vietnamese and ethnic minorities when it comes to access to opportunities and the widening gap between the very wealthy and the rest of the population. It is said, I've never been, that the gap is particularly graphic in towns like Hanoi, where you see motorbikes carrying huge cargoes of 4 to 5 people driving side by side with flashy cars owned by the super rich. Lynn is from a village, and she lived in this village with her husband and children, and although her husband farmed and she worked full-time in a factory sewing clothes for export, she didn't make enough to make ends meet. She didn't make enough to pay for her children's education or even to have the basic that she needed to live with dignity. So her family took a loan, which was the equivalent of 2 years' salary, and the idea was that she would pay an agent to get a supposedly well-paid job in Europe. But once in Europe, things didn't work out as planned. She was exploited, her employer withheld her wages and her passport and threatened to deport her if she complained. Eventually she left with one of her friends, and today she's fighting for compensation. Lynn's fate is not unique. It's similar to the many millions of people living in poverty the world over. And although there has been progress, as we heard earlier, through the Millennium Development Goals in addressing inequality and poverty, it's important to remember that over 1 billion people today go to bed hungry. Income and wealth inequality rates, according to Oxfam, are among the highest in the last half century. And many people today don't have access to basic services like education, healthcare, or decent accommodation. This was a very long slide. The slide basically gives recent statistics released by Oxfam that 62 of the richest people in the world own the same wealth as the 36 billion poorest people. So it's little wonder that, like Lynn, many decide to migrate in search of the possibility to live with dignity. And the idea is to send money back to their families. Remittances are huge. This is a mistake. It's not 550 million. I left out 3 zeros. It's 550 billion. And most of it goes to developing countries. Somalia is one example. In Somalia, remittances make up between 25 and 40% of the country's economy, which is huge. More than the amount it receives in humanitarian aid, development aid, and foreign direct investment altogether. Nearly half the population depends on these remittances, not to buy something extra, but to meet their daily needs. For many migrants, the choice to leave is a lonely choice. They leave alone, and it's a heartbreaking one. It involves leaving everything behind and to give your family the possibility to live, basically. This is a photo of migrant workers waving to their families just before they board the plane. It was taken by Shahidul Alam moments before they boarded. And talking about the photo, this is what he says. He says, many stop just before boarding. The cocky gait has gone. The sad faces look out longingly at the small figures silhouetted on the rooftops. They wave and they wave and they wave until they're pushed into the plane. And they disengage, probably realizing for the first time just what they're leaving behind. The reality is that for the poor, the options to migrate legally are very limited. So it's no wonder that many refugees and people who are leaving because they are poor resort to smugglers, agents, traffickers, and the costs are huge, as you can see from this slide. Many who travel illegally lose their lives, and those who make it are often punished because of their irregular migration status. Worse, they're portrayed as undeserving of support and assistance because they are only economic migrants. Others, like Lynn, fall victim to traffickers, and they find themselves vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. It's good to remember that many migrant workers, even if they're not trafficked, are effectively tied to their jobs because they have undertaken huge debts to make this journey, and their stay is totally dependent on their employer. In the light of all this, the indispensability on the one hand and the human cost on the other, it's no wonder that one of the targets is to facilitate orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migration of people, not of rich people, as it is today, but of all people, even the poor. We might ask, why should we bother? No one asked them to come. We don't need them. It's about them, not about us. But I say no, and I'd like to close with a quote from Martin Luther King, which I think brilliantly sums up why we should bother. He says, whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And as Martin Luther King says, you can read it in the next slide when it appears, we're called to act. Sitting on the sidelines shouldn't be an option. Let's not be indicted in the future by our indifference, our fear, and our unwillingness to take action to promote human dignity. Thank you.
Thanks, Katrine.